Hey guys, I'm Whaleman, and I wanted to talk today about some of the different seam types that we have available on the suits, and the different stresses they can take, what they're good for, and so that way you can make a good informed decision when you order one of our suits. I really just wanted to make sure that you understand the limits of each of these and the benefits of each of these different seam types. The cheaper cost for one, the more expensive cost for the other, what they can each handle, what do you really need for your application, how you're going to use it. Everybody uses these things differently, so just want to make sure that you understand so you can make a good decision, and that way you'll be happy with it, because we get some people that end up with the pup fox suits, the balloon dogs, things like that, and it's a cheaper technique. We're not trying to cheat anybody. It's just that's the technology that's out there, and that's what it can handle. And you just need to really kind of understand that, so that you're not pushing it past what it is intended for. If you need that kind of durability, we can totally do that. It's just going to be more expensive.
The four seam types are pinched, overlapped, reinforced pinched, and reinforced butt seam. First, we will talk about pinched seams.
A pinched seam, which is when the material is put together like this and then kind of welded across. Pinched seams are basically the typical seam that you'll see on most pool toys. That seam flap can either be facing out, which you'll see a lot of times on like the Intex whale. That main body seam is done that way. They can sometimes trim it pretty close, but it usually will stick out a little more on one side. Or they can a lot of times invert it. Not all the seams can be inverted, obviously, because you'll have to have one final seam that sticks out. One of the shortcomings of the pinch seam is that as you create this weld, the weld is going to basically kind of melt the plastic, and it's going to kind of smoosh some of that plastic out as you're pushing pressure on it. And it's going to create a bead, a little weld bead, kind of, just at the very opening of that. And the bead is never going to be perfect. In fact, if you look at it under a microscope, it's going to be a little lumpy. And the problem with that is that when you inflate and it starts to really pull that apart, it's putting all that force along that bead of weld. And if it were perfect, if it was a perfect straight line, that geometry is what's the important thing. If it was a perfect straight line, then you'd have no problems. It would actually be very strong. But unfortunately, because there are little imperfections in that, when you start to really inflate tight, it's going to eventually find one of those little imperfections, and it's going to pull harder on that spot than anywhere else. And once that spot rips, once one little tiny spot rips, usually you end up with a catastrophic failure most of the time, because all of that stress is basically kind of channeled to that seam. Because if you think about it like a balloon, if everything is even and the same thickness, as you expand, everything's going to be even, but the seam is the problem. It's thicker in that spot. It can't stretch the same as the rest of the material. So you basically kind of focus a lot of this energy, this stress, when you really tightly inflate. This is really where this comes into play. So that one spot of imperfection is getting all this like energy channeled at it, and then once it happens, it usually will just shoot down that seam, because all that energy is kind of focused along that seam. And when you get it started, it just... So that's kind of the issue with a pinch seam.
Next, we will talk about overlap seams.
The overlap seam is basically when you just take two pieces of material and overlap them and, weld across both of them. And that seam is a bit better because now when you inflate, it's actually more of a shear force. It's not trying to peel apart. And so this is a whole lot better, but unfortunately, you kind of have some similar problems where when you go to weld, if it's a perfect weld, if it is absolutely straight, and there are no like discontinuities with the weld, when they do this, a lot of times they're going to weld like a section, and then they're going to come and they're going to weld the next section. If they don't get those lined up perfectly, now you kind of have a bit of a problem there. It doesn't translate as serious as when you have a pinch seam, but it still can cause some problems. You're pulling this material and it's kind of doing this. Well, if you have a spot that is not perfectly lined up, then it's going to be it's going to get a little more stress than everything else. Also, actually, what tends to be even more of a problem than that, though, is when they go to weld it, it's the pressure that they put on the material. They really have to take into consideration the thicknesses of those materials and how much can they really weld. If you don't limit it, you're just going to go all the way through, and then it's going to just be a hole. Well, they have to set the travel distance on the machine when the head comes down to weld. How far does it come down? And that's super important, because if you go too far, then basically what you have done is where normally this would be, twice the thickness where it overlaps, you might end up having a thinner spot than the rest of the material around. So when you start to inflate, all this area, is equal thickness, except for your weld, which is thinner. And, there's only so much that can take. Depends on how thin it is. So a lot of times what you can do, if you have an overlap weld like that, you can actually hold it up to the light and you can see how thin it is. Light usually is going to go through it. Even black material, it looks brown when you hold it up to the light, and you can see any thin spots. You can actually kind of see all your imperfections if you hold it up to a bright light. The overlap seam is not necessarily better than a pinch seam. It kind of depends on the factory. It depends on the techniques and what they're more familiar with. We can actually glue a reinforcement strip across or on the back side of it, and that makes it nearly indestructible, because at that point you don't have the problem of this like on the pinch seam with this uneven weld bead. That's now gone because you fill that in with glue and you've got another piece there to reinforce it. And same thing with the overlap, that just really strengthens everything, any kind of imperfections. It does still have a limit. Everything does. You're still going to run into the problem eventually, whereas if you overinflate it so tight that eventually you exceed the limits of what the material can handle. It depends on the thickness of it, but that seam is thicker and it's not going to stretch the same as the rest of the material. So eventually you're going to end up with holes beside it, is usually what ends up happening, because that material that's right on that interface between the thicker and the thin, it's like, I'm trying to pull, and who's going to win this tug of war? Well, the thicker side's going to win, and the thinner side's going to rip, and it's going to be, usually that ends up in just pinholes. That doesn't usually end up in a, like a catastrophic failure. So that's an option, is you can always have glued reinforcement strips. That's expensive because that's a manual labor of having to actually apply glue and put it across the seam and, roll it out.
Now we will talk about reinforced pinch seams.
The other thing that can be done is that actually is very strong. The factory that does our reinforced butt seams, they also do a pinch seam, and their pinch seams are really, really good. They've got it down, but in some places it still needs reinforcement. So what they do is they say, okay, we'll make you a pinch seam suit, but in some places where there's some negative curves, and where we see that there's going to be a little bit more stress, we're going to actually take and we're going to take a strip of material, kind of like we do the butt seam, and we're going to put it behind there, and then we're going to weld it. So they're going to first, do a pinch seam, then they're going to come back over it, and they're going to put a strip either on this side or on this side, and this will just kind of get smashed over with a strip and then welded. So basically you end up with a flat seam that's kind of like a lap seam, but kind of more like a butt seam, reinforced butt seam, because you don't really have any like edges or anything. It's just totally welded flat. Very strong. So honestly, as kind of a general overview of the different seam types, the pinch seam is great if you just want a suit that is something that you're going to walk around a con in. You're not going to necessarily be putting a lot of pressure on it. The pinch seam is one where you don't want to probably inflate it to 100% unless you're not going to move. If you're not going to move, that's fine. When you go to move, if you're fighting it, if you try to move your arm and there's resistance, well, think about it this way: as you're fighting against that resistance, that has to, go somewhere. It's going to stress something, and most likely, it's probably like if you move your arm and it's hard to move, you're going to be putting stress on this seam where it attaches to the body. So, in your mind, as you're moving, if you can just be mindful of it, like I am when I wear it, I kind of know, well, if I do this and if it's hard to move, I might have to be doing a repair later because I know that that's putting a lot of stress on certain seams. So being mindful is really a big thing. If you want to be able to move around, and you have a suit that is a pinch seam suit, like a pup fox suit, then don't inflate it all the way. Inflate it enough to kind of give it its shape, but don't go to 100%. Don't go to the point where it's hard to move, because now you're fighting it and you're risking, stressing the seams too much. So really, I think a lot of it is just knowing the limits and, just acting accordingly. So also knowing how you're going to use it ahead of time. So if you want to do, bondage real tight, you really like a lot of pressure, which I do, then you might want to actually get a suit that is maybe the reinforced butt seams, or maybe the reinforced pinch seam is actually a really good one. I just tested a white jackal suit, and it was made with the reinforced pinch seam, and I've not had a failure with it. And I've tested it 3 times, one time for about an hour and a half, and was very rough with it. So that's a really good option.
Now let's talk about reinforced butt seams.
Going from there, you've got the reinforced butt seam. And basically, it's where you take 2 pieces of material and you butt them up against each other like this, but then you bring in a strip that welds a bridge, and it's on the inside, so you don't really see it, across. So a lot of the higher end custom inflatable toys, actually, that's a good example of one right there. They use that type of seam technique, and it is actually very strong. The reinforced butt seam is definitely the strongest. It's got the most consistent material along that, and you don't run into the same problems that you do with the overlap seam, because you've got this extra piece underneath it that's bridging the gap. And also the factory that does that technique, they're very skilled. So they really have it down to a science as far as like how much travel when they go to weld to make sure that's not too thin, not to pull on it. They even do some modifications to the actual welding tools. A lot of them will have texture on it to help get the air bubbles out. And so there's a lot of, fine tuning that they've done to really, to nail this. You really want like the ultimate strength. You're going to pay for it because it takes a lot more labor. It takes like 3 passes to go over every seam to do these reinforced butt seams, but it is just nearly indestructible. It's the seam that is on the polymer ring and blimp. And you've seen some of the videos, like you can just jump on that thing and it's basically nearly indestructible. So just kind of depends on how you want to use it. If you need it real strong, you can get that done. It's a little more expensive. Or if you don't need that, the factory that does, the balloon dogs and those pinch seams, you get what you pay for. That's why some of those suits are kind of in the like $600-700 range. That technology is not super expensive. That's why some of the other suits, like the werewolf, they're a lap seam. Again, not quite as strong as like the butt seam. You know, if your pinch seam is here with the like balloon dog factory, then your hyena and your werewolf is kind of here with the lap seam, and then your reinforced pinch seam is up here, and then your can't even see my hand. The reinforced butt seam is just way up there. So anyways, thanks for listening, and hopefully this helps. The idea is understanding all the risks so that you can make a good informed decision. Thanks.